Dusk falls over a scarred French wheat field. A dozen men in mismatched uniforms move with a quiet urgency, hands steady from studio work, not drills. They unroll bellies of rubber and canvas, bolt poles into mud, and pump air into hulking shapes that, seen from the sky, read as armor. A painter drags a brush through lacquer and grease, carving shadows that obey a lens. A radio operator threads a spool of wire and murmurs the clipped cadences of a colonel who does not exist. Above them, an Allied reconnaissance plane hums, cataloguing shapes and shadows. If that pilot files the wrong report, the enemy will shuffle brigades into the wrong valley. Bridges will stand. Flanks will be exposed. None of this will be in dispatches. This is theater in the mud. Imagination as ordnance. They are billboard men, stage hands, sound engineers, recruited to lie with the precision of artists. Inflatable tanks bloom like rubber flowers. Speakers tuned to recorded convoys rumble from hilltops. Radio nets sing false life into empty fields. Their arsenal is paint, plywood, phonograph records. A gust snags a top. A seam yawns. "Hold that seam!" someone hisses. Fingers smart with tar. The pump stutters. The plane drops lower, banking for a better picture. Voices thin to wire. The radio operator freezes on a syllable. His hand tightens on the mic. Someone whispers, "Don't breathe." The camera shutters begin to wind. For a single suspended breath, every painted panel, every carefully faked shadow must be a convincing lie. Beyond the mud, time collapses into possibility, discovery or salvation. They called it an experiment at first, a classroom answer to a battlefield problem. But the idea carried the weight of lives. Hooked to a map table in a War Department briefing room, a colonel traced routes with a finger and said quietly, "We can't be everywhere, but we can make them think we are." Around him sat men who had spent their lives selling ideas to customers, not saving them with smoke and shadow. The question was blunt. How do you turn art into armor? What followed was an argument made of diagrams and stubborn imagination. Deception had long been part of Allied doctrine. Feints and false radio chatter had confused enemy commanders before, but this proposal was different. A mobile, surgical unit whose weapons were paint, plywood, and sound. It would be small, fast, and theatrical. Some officers scoffed. Others, edged by casualty reports and stalled offensives, listened close enough to be convinced. Recruitment read like a who's who of creative trades. Men were plucked from advertising houses, theater shops, art schools, and radio studios. A Broadway set designer signed a form next to a billboard painter. A recording engineer traded high fidelity for field cans. The montage of enlistment felt absurd. Charcoal smudges on draft forms, portfolios folded into footlockers, headshots next to dog tags. Yet every man who volunteered kept the same nervous grin. They did not enlist to kill. They enlisted to craft believable lies that would make killing less necessary elsewhere. Training was a laboratory of odd, urgent disciplines. In muddy fields, they rehearsed the ballet of inflating rubber decoys until seams and shadow read as steel from 100 feet above. Painters learned to fake mud and rust. Their brushes learned to mimic years of rolling through French lanes in a single stroke. Sound engineers recorded layer upon layer of mechanical life, clanking tracks, muffled commands, the rhythm of diesel, then learned how to amplify distance to make a single speaker sound like a convoy rolling down a valley. Radio operators drilled in cadence and jargon until their fake transmissions felt like real arguments over coffee and maps. Skepticism hardened into a test. A conventional officer walked the perimeter of a field exercise, a clipboard in hand, and asked the question that haunted the unit. Will the enemy actually look at this and change his plans? An artist, paint under his nails, answered not with statistics, but with a theaterman's logic. Give them a story they can read from a distance. Make every camera see the same story. They won't ask why. They'll act. That simple claim was vindicated when aerial photos of the mock array were reviewed. From reconnaissance height, The phantoms were persuasive enough to fool trained analysts. By the end, the men had, oddly, become both soldiers and stagehands. They packed trunks with paint, rolls of canvas and phonograph records like props for a traveling play. Orders stamped top secret slipped between paintbrushes and tickets. The work they were about to do would be invisible in the annals of glory. On a rain-slick dock, they loaded gear into crates and watched familiar cities shrink into fog. Each man carried the same private thought: we can build an army out of lies, but what happens if the lie tears? As the transport steamed away across a grey sea, one veteran tightened the strap on a crate marked "Decor." He ran a thumb across the stenciled letters and imagined a horizon full of cameras and of consequences. The sea swallowed the shore. Ahead lay fields that would mistake canvas for steel. The rubber arrives folded like a sleeping animal, heavy, slick, impossible until someone breathes life into it. A hand finds a valve, a pump huffs, and the skin swells into a turreted silhouette. Close up, a seam is stitched with brass buckles and canvas tape. A painter drags a brush along a painted tread, stippling mud where the sun would expect a shadow. "Give it a belly scrape," someone says, voice low. They read that. The men work with the careful patience of prop makers. Rivet suggestion, dented fender, a radiator grill painted on to catch a lens. Around them, the arsenal rearranges itself, wooden frames rigged like truck cabs, canvas backdrops that fold into horizons, painted mud tracks leading to nowhere. On a hill, a truck opens like a throat and reveals banks of speakers and a phonograph. A sound engineer slides a record into a player and layers a low diesel throb, the clank of treads and the staccato bark of shouted orders. The engineers listen, then trim the bass. "Too much low end," one says. "It'll vibrate the barn and give you depth, but you want mass, not a drum." They measure distance by ear. A lieutenant stands at the next ridge and signals when the sound snaps into believable convoy rhythm. Radio operators sit with headphones, learning not just words but habit. Deception isn't lexicon, it's timing. They copy the sleepy pauses of a division net. The habit of an XO to sigh before giving coordinates. The cadence of a company commander who ends every sentence with "over." "If you sound like them, you are them," an instructor murmurs, as men practice call signs until their speech is indistinguishable from the unit they pretend to be. Patches are swapped on jackets. False headquarters signs are erected and illuminated at night to cast long, believable signatures. They call these 4 pillars: what you see, what you hear, what you intercept, and who you pretend to be. Alone, each tool is plausible. Together, they tell a single story to any camera, any ear, any intercept. They anchor rubber tanks with ropes and sunk stakes so shadows fall the right way. They paint oil drips that from altitude read as weathering. They time the creak of a canvas gate to match recorded GIs moving through. Then a tiny betrayal, a scratch in a groove. Mid-rehearsal, the phonograph hiccups. A convoy that had rolled smoothly now repeats a single clank, an impossible echo that rings like a hiccup in the lie. Heads turn. On the ridge, the lieutenant freezes and scopes the valley. 2 minutes of mechanical looping can unmask the whole story. The enemy needs only one oddity to suspect a trick. Improvisation follows like instinct. A stagehand slams a tin plate with a mallet to disguise the repeat. A radio operator starts an ad-lib of live chatter that masks the loop. Painters dash sooty hands across the seam as if patching a real vehicle. "Make it maintenance," someone says. "Make the loop a breakdown, and they'll see manwork. Not machine." The fix isn't elegant in its desperate craft, but it buys a heartbeat. A reconnaissance plane slices the cloud and takes its photograph. Later, in dim rooms where images are burned onto paper, an analyst pins the frame to a light box. The silhouette's red like a column of armor. A pencil ticks a box. Potential armored regiment. Recommend response. For a moment, the men who made the lie watch a paper decision that will send real units down the wrong road, and the craft feels like power and like weight. They have learned how to fool a camera. They have learned how to lie, so that lives move differently because of it. But as the analysts celebrate a convincing photo, a signals intercept drops onto a technician's desk, muffled, translated. Terse, unusual activity, verify. Someone in the enemy's listening post hears something they cannot place. The victory is thin and immediate and terrifying. The deception works, but somewhere a question has been raised. The men who build ghosts realize they have only bought time, and that time may already have an expiration. Ships grind into port under a sky the color of wet metal. Men shoulder footlockers and crates stamp decor, trunks heavy with deflated rubber and phonograph records. The wood smells of tar. Rain rinses everything into grey. On the dock, a billboard painter folds his portfolio into a blanket. A sound engineer tightens a spool of wire and studies a map like a stage plan. Offloading is precise. The decoys must survive rough hands and salt water. By dawn, they stand in fields scarred by shells and hedgerows. They unroll props, stake down inflated turrets, and paint rust and traffic scuffs so lenses see years in an hour. Sound trucks climb ridgelines. Speakers cough a diesel hum. Radios begin stage chatter. They practice the illusion overnight and vanish before day. The deception must look natural from altitude and meaningful to any interpreter. They operate where war and art collide, close enough to be credible, far enough to survive. Frontline officers watch with a mixture of scorn and dependency. A colonel with mud under his nails asks how paint can save lives. A young artist, hands black with tar, answers, "Perception kills as surely as bullets." Tell the camera a story, and they will move to meet it. The colonel listens, then changes a plan. In one operation, they conjure an armored regiment overnight, rows of rubber turrets, painted supply dumps, and radios simulating frantic logistics. While the enemy stares towards the phantom column, real units cross a river under moonlight. By dawn, aerial photos show hostile armor massing. Reserves are shifted. Commanders write orders. Lives pivot on that misreading. Close calls become their true tests. One night, 2 enemy scouts creep past the hedgerow, silent and suspicious. Men freeze mid-stroke. A twig cracks. A mechanic slams a tarpaulin over a turret and paints a fresh mud smear, while a soundman feeds a maintenance loop into the speaker. The scouts linger, frown, and go. Everyone exhales. 2 minutes later, the convoy they've faked rolls harmlessly into an empty valley. Little victories add up. A bridge seized, a flank opened, a town taken with fewer casualties because reserves were misallocated. They watch smoke over a distant hill and understand they've shifted danger away from where friends press forward. There are no parades, only stamped reports and quiet thanks over coffee. At night, artists write what the censor will not. A painter folds a ration wrapper and scrawls, "We paint tanks that will never move. We make noise that fools ears and saves men." It is strange to be proud of a trick that got comrades home. He folds the note into his kit as the dawn scrubs the field. They strike camp quickly, roll seams back into trunks, and load phonograph records like contraband. As they drive through ruined lanes, a faint intercept crosses a signals desk. Unusual activity. Verify. Command sends word that a much larger operation will soon move and that deception must be scaled accordingly. The men, tired and wary, look at each other under a tightening sky. They have fooled armies. Next time, they may be the ones being counted on. The transport turns, and the road ahead is smaller than the map they were given. In the back of a truck, a radio operator listens to static, imagining that somewhere an enemy ear has begun to suspect. A stagehand counts pumps and brushes. A painter stares at a half-finished turret and thinks of home. They exchange no boasts, only the small ritual of tightening straps. The bus climbs into cloud, and the field closes behind them like a curtain. The orders arrive in a paper envelope stamped "Top Secret." In a cold tent, under a map pinned with brass tacks, a staff officer lays out the plan with a finger that does not tremble. "You make them believe we're coming down this valley. Keep them looking there for 72 hours. We cross the river at dawn 2 ridges over. If that column looks real, reserves won't arrive in time." If it fails, our boys get stuck on the bank. Silence crowds the little room. The men who know how to make smoke and sound trade glances, equal parts exhilaration and dread. This is the sort of deception that could change a campaign. Or shred a life, they move at once. Inflatable tanks are unrolled like sleeping beasts. Seams are laced and valves opened. Painters mix the exact hue of mud at that latitude, brown with a certain grey, then stipple in rust and spent rounds. Wooden cabs are nailed together. False tarps are draped over empty frames. On the ridge, a sound truck groans as a phonograph takes a record and layers a diesel thump with the metallic clatter of tracks. The shout of a sergeant, the intermittent cough of a stalled engine. Radios buzz as operators rehearse the tiny habits that make speech human. The way a colonel clears his throat before a coordinate. The habit of a sergeant to curse and then apologize. They call it four-part harmony, visual, sonic, radio, impersonation, each piece tuned until the whole reads as a living division. Preparation is a theater of small miracles. A painter runs his brush along a seam until the light catches like a dent. A stagehand rigs a pulley so a decoy's turret slews, just so when the wind blows. A sound engineer adjusts treble until the diesel is heavy, but not muddy. They test with aerial plates. A reconnaissance plane circles and takes a frame. Back at the lightbox, analysts mark silhouettes that look like armor. The men who made the lie stand over the photograph like anxious parents. A pencil ticks a box. Threat, recommend redeployment. The plan moves, then the air changes. A black cloud climbs the ridge and a recon plane comes in lower than anyone expected. Rain hammers like an impatient drummer. Water sheets across canvas, blurring paint and muting speakers. Records hiss with water in their grooves. A speaker goes quiet with a faint mortal smell. The amplifier has cooked itself. Down in the fold of a decoy, a seam tears with an audible rip, and a rubber turret collapses like a giant breath being taken in. Someone whispers, "Now!" Improvisation is their language. A stagehand swings up onto the ruined skin and jams a pole through the torn valve, bracing it like a bone. Rain sluices off his cap as he works. Hands that once nailed scenery now hold a canvas that must read as armor under a lens. A painter slaps fresh paint in the pattern of mud streaks, where the tear would be visible from the air. Close up, it's a bad repair, but from altitude it reads as months of wear. A soundman lobs a wrench against a drum to mask the record's skip, creating an honest-sounding maintenance noise. Radio operators slide into open nets and riff, "Minor hold for refit. Awaiting fuel convoy." Over, they thread live chatter around the playback, so any enemy listener hears a human problem, not a machine. A patrol moves close enough that the crunch of boots can be heard through whispering grass. Men hold still like statues. A spotlight sweeps in the distance. The stagehand holds the patched seam with his whole weight until the beam passes. Bullets hammer a ridge beyond them, and the sound ricochets through their bones. For a time, it is just breath, skin, and the taste of iron in the mouth. The plane comes back. It takes the photograph. This time the frame is perfect. Rows of what read to a lens like battle-worn armor, supply tents, the scattered geometry of a division preparing to thrust. At command posts the ink moves. Troops begin to shuffle. Orders travel along wires, and men who will never know look up and find their path changed. Lights blink across the river, where pontoon bridges begin to fold into place. Under the same dawn, the real division steps into the cold water and climbs the far bank, while artillery draws the enemy's eye. They watch from a ridge as plumes of smoke mark the breakthrough. Relief is sudden and enormous. Men who have been taught with fear collapse into one another with the awkward hug of people who have held their hands above a flame together. A painter laughs, a short shock-sour sound. "We actually did it," someone says, but triumph is complicated. Back at the tent, a clerk slides another envelope across the map table. Orders to destroy. Burn the props. Break the records. Foul no mention in letters. You signed on for secrecy. The throatiness of his voice leaves no room for question. The men look at the crate of painted rubber and plywood as if it were a body. They start a fire out behind the tents. Canvas curls, colors flare, and the smell of burning paint fills the night like regret. One man sits with his paint-streaked hands over the flames until the heat leaves a red edge in his palms. He stares at the pyre and whispers, half to himself and half to the glowing embers, "We made them move. We saved men." The flames crack and answer with a small, hungry noise. Around him, other faces are lit in orange and shadow. For a moment, the contours of stagehands and soldiers blur into the same silhouette. They have won a battle they cannot tell anyone they fought in. As the last piece of wood stumbles into embers, a radio coughs to life with a single cold line. New assignment. Move at dusk. No records. The envelope has another stamp. The map lays open to a place none of them have seen. They fold without fanfare, shoulders straightening as if they were just after the curtain call, moving already toward the next lie they must make true. Dawn after the last operation is thin and cold. The tents sag with wet canvas and exhaustion. Men move like people leaving a theater after the final act, some smiling, some hollowed. A handful crack a can of beer and pass it around in near silence. Someone produces a harmonica and plays a tune so soft it could be a prayer. Elsewhere, a medic counts names on a list and marks the ones who didn't come back. The laughter dies as if someone pulled a curtain. There are small, private celebrations, handshakes, a cigarette passed with a nod, but joy sits beside grief like an old companion. They share stories that end in silence, and for every joke, there is an account of a field hospital or a roadblock where men paid the price. Their success is measured in maps and in the absence of bodies, where there might have been many more. The victory tastes like copper and smoke, because those saved by deception are not trophies, but faces in frames that will never bear this story. Demobilization is a peculiar ritual. Trunks are packed with paint, phonograph records, and deflated skins folded like guilty books. Officers collect binders stamped with classifications and issue razor-edged orders, burn everything that cannot be inventoried, bury the rest in coded crates, and sign the oath of silence. That night, they build a small pyre behind the mess tent and feed canvas and plywood into flames. Paint curls and boils, colors flare and die. Men stand watching the fire eat the props that had kept other men alive, feeling both relief and shame as if they were burning parts of themselves. Home is not a soft landing. On trains and buses, they fold back into civilian clothes, but their hands remember different grammars, how to shadow with paint, where to put a catch in a radio cadence, how to make a flat shape look like depth. A billboard painter returns to his studio and paints with a new economy, years of weather in a single stroke. He accepts commissions and wins praise, but when neighbors ask where he learned to age steel with a brush, he smiles and says, "Around." He will not tell his wife about the nights he slept in wet canvas. He will not tell his students that he once forged an army to save a bridge. The skill that rescued soldiers becomes an unspeakable talent. Years later, a reunion gathers in a dim room where faces have deepened and voices carry the gravel of experience. They trade the small, exquisite details, how to tape a seam so the light reads like rust, which record had the cough that could be passed off as maintenance. They laugh at things only they can find funny, and they weep quietly for those who are not there to laugh with them. Questions from outsiders are answered with a shake of the head. The old pact holds. Yet among them, someone keeps a photograph tucked in a wallet, a faded aerial plate where rubber turrets read like iron. They look at it as if it were contraband and touch it with the reverence of survivors. In military archives, clerks slide thick folders into metal drawers, reports stamped with black ink, top secret no forwarding, are sealed with wax and pushed into cold vaults. The sound of the vault door closing is small and final, a sound like a verdict. For decades, the record sleeps, evidence of lives shaped by illusion, contained in a room no visitor may enter. Outside, the men disperse into city streets and classrooms, into marriage and studio. keepers of a truth they were sworn not to reveal. But not all history stays buried. One photograph, one tape, one memory can be stubborn. As the vault door thuds shut, an old hand lingers on the metal for a heartbeat longer than duty requires. The man inhales, the air tasting faintly of paint and smoke, and thinks, without deciding whether to say it aloud, that someday someone will ask to open that drawer. Years become decades. A rusted folder is opened, a stamp is lifted, and secrets breathed out into daylight. The tapes of diesel groans and simulated convoys, once sealed beneath wax and protocol, find table space in museums. Photographs of painted turrets and canvas columns hang beside wartime posters. Curators whisper that art saved soldiers. Books arrive. Documentaries splice interviews with old men whose hands still know the stroke of rust. Gallery lights warm faces that for years painted in shadow. Famous painter turned advertising artist returns to a canvas with the same economy of weather he once learned to fake. His brush strokes still carry the weight of nights on wet fields. An old radio operator presses a reel-to-reel into a curator's palm. The hiss becomes a testimony. "Listen," he says. The room leans in as diesel becomes memory, as fake chatter snaps into human cadence. Young soldiers in modern simulation labs study the Ghost Army's methods. Instructors point out the lineage from inflatable decoy to information operations. Recognition arrives slowly, and without the fanfare the men were denied. Plaques are laid in quiet fields, a memorial small and unadorned. Names neither divisions nor battles, but offers a single sentence. For those who saved lives by making the world look like something other than it was. At dawn, visitors stand with coffee and a shiver. Imagining rubber tanks under a pale sky, there is pride, but the men who survived know the trade's cost. The craft of deception is a moral tool, blunt and precise. They smile at being seen, yet they are haunted by faces whose decisions were shaped by their art. The last shot lingers on the empty field at sunrise, the grass pale, the plaque steady, reminding us that some of the decisive battles are fought not with shells, with perception.